Hello, everyone. Here we are for the fourth conversation with Miki Kashtan in the series called Apart and Together as a response to coronavirus and the opportunities it brings for creating change for a world that works for all. The conversations are accompanying a series of articles Miki has been writing in the last 3 months in the same context. So, Miki, your article on which this interview is based is about systemic solutions for systemic problems.
Mm-hmm.
So, in your article, you point out the dominant belief in modern society under capitalism for making sense of the problems, that every problem comes from individual behaviors and should be solved by individuals with individual solutions. Then you argue that coronavirus actually proves this is not the case. It shows the close connection between individual choices and the social structures. So it means that most of the major problems can only be solved by being addressed within the social systems. In order for us to see this systemic cause and effect, I find it important to understand the dynamics of social systems. Like you mentioned, the narratives in which systems regenerate themselves. So can you tell us about these narratives and like also why is it so hard to see them and how they impact people, particularly like people with more access to resources and people with less or no access to resources?
Yeah. So first of all, I want to say that narratives are only one part of the cycle of systems reproducing themselves. And as hard as narratives are to see, some of the other pieces might be even harder to see. So I want to give the full picture of what the cycle is so that we can look at where narratives are. Because every piece of this cycle reinforces every other piece of the cycle, which is part of why it's so hard to see. So let's say if we start from the narratives and we just focus on the narratives, then we don't have an understanding of why do we have the narratives that we have and why do narratives change? When do they change? How do they change? Is that something that we can do anything about, or do narratives come, kind of like from the gods? And so I'm going to say that narratives both influence what kind of social structures we're going to create, and also are directly and indirectly influenced by the social structures. So for example, if we have a narrative that says that human beings cannot be trusted, that every single one of us is out for ourselves, and all the other pieces that I know are pretty familiar because that's what we've all been growing up with, those kinds of narratives would lead us to want to create social institutions that are based on control. You have to control all these bad people that are just out to get themselves. So if they're going to be in control, that's the social institutions, they're going to be based on control and separation. Then when parents and teachers are trying to prepare new generations to function within those institutions, what will it be like for you when you grow up to go to work? What will it be like for you when you grow up to find someone to build a relationship with and have children with? What will it be like for you when you grow up to be a citizen of a country? All of these things, parents think about them. And when you think about them, you're going to try to prepare your children for those institutions, not for some other institutions in some other society that doesn't exist, because you want your child to do well. So like, for example, when my sister and her wife were raising their son in a fully collaborative way, a lot of people were telling them, that's really nice and well, but you're not preparing him for what society is going to be like. He's going to suffer. It's never happened. He's doing quite well in society. Actually, better than many because he has more tools, more capacity, more self-trust, more inner direction, all kinds of things that we all wish we had. But in the moment when you are raising a child, it's very hard to hold on to doing it in a way that's different from the norm, because you think that the norm prepares them for the institutions that they are. And you also take the narratives into account. If the narrative says that people can't be trusted, that everybody's out for themselves, you're going to tell your child, hey, watch out. There are all these terrible people out there who are going to try to take advantage of you, to do this, to do that. Be careful, protect yourself. And what you're going to do is you're then going to basically tell your child, just care about yourself, don't care about others, because if you care about others, you'll be taken advantage of. I'm, of course, super oversimplifying it just to show the cycle. And then your child is going to learn that and is going to behave in these ways. And then that will reinforce the story, because everybody will look at your son and go, see, here's another example of a person who is just out there to look out for themselves. And this cycle continues. And so the question is, where can we create change? That is the question that is interesting, because what we are doing, the piece about finding individual solutions rather than systemic solutions, keeps us focused just at the level of human behavior, without seeing that the human behavior is not actually something that spontaneously arose from each individual. It is something that is shaped within the context of the narratives and the institutions and the socialization practices that we have in any given society or subculture. So that's how it flows. And I think I only answered half of your question, so I imagine you have a follow-up.
Yes, it's like I have now this question, how to create change. Like, and to me, it seems like the first change might be at the very beginning, the way we see it, or the way we cannot see it. So it's like, because we see only this individual cause and effect.
Yeah. Yeah, we see a much smaller loop. I will do something different, it will have different results, as if all the other stuff doesn't even exist. So the question of how do we create change, is the biggest question there is, because there are many of us who want to see a different world, but we have been trying for quite a while, so far quite unsuccessfully. So that means there's something we haven't figured out. And I'm not going to say or pretend like, oh, and I know what we should do instead, and I'm going to tell you, and let's now go out and do it, because I don't actually know. What I do know is that we cannot keep trying to do the same thing and expect different results, the basic definition of insanity. So that means, in a way, that all bets are off. The place that makes the coronavirus interesting is because it exposes it. Because the coronavirus, the pandemic, overall, the fact that there is a pandemic is caused by systemic factors. The pandemic itself, there's very good reason to believe, is caused first by destruction of ecosystems, second by making humans desperate, and third by having very unskillful ways of attending to the resulting spread of disease. And so all of these things happen at systemic levels. It's not what we do. So sure, each one of us individually might be able to protect ourselves better or worse, depending on what we think about what is the right thing to protect or not protect. And there are all kinds of controversies about it. But the same individual with the same choice will have a different risk depending on what country you are in. If you're in Vietnam, you have almost no risk. Vietnam had a few hundred cases, so far has had a few hundred cases of the COVID disease, despite having a long border with China. They've never been through a countrywide lockdown. only spot lockdowns of specific areas where there were little spreads of disease, and it never went very far. Other places, it became, like a wildfire. And there are all kinds of reasons why here it's this way and there it's that way. But as an individual, your actual options are different depending on where you are in the world. And that's something that you can now see, where before, it would be easier to kind of like not really see it. Now it's exposed. So I think that we have a time when there is a little bit more ripeness to put into the, what would I call it? The uncontrollable, unpredictable space of ideas. One more drop into, maybe it's not individual. That's all that I'm saying. It's not like because this is happening now, everything is going to change. Now there's an opportunity that didn't exist before to see. And once we see something, there are other steps towards change, but it is the first thing, is to see that what is happening is not the only thing that could happen.
Yeah, I was thinking of the same thing, that diagram that your dear sister Inbal came up with shows the individual behaviors. If everyone imbibed or integrated NVC into their lives. And could you explain that?
Okay.
Also with the needs awareness or something specific to NVC.
Sure. So one of the things that I like to do in general is I like to play with a magic wand. Because having a magic wand, an imaginary magic wand, obviously I don't have a real one, but having an imaginary magic wand allows us to do thought experiments, release us from certain kind of mental constraints. And in that sense, it gets us out of the official narrative and we can think freshly. Mm-hmm. So I want to say, first of all, when you say if everyone practiced NVC and had need awareness, that if is already on the other side of a magic wand. Because for me, the reason why we don't have billions of people practicing NVC, that reason is also systemic. Because at this stage of human evolution, practicing NVC is an act of courage. A lot more people are exposed to NVC that actually take on the practice as a systematic study and change of behavior. A lot more. Oh yeah, I did that training, people say. What does it mean, I did that training? It's like, check, now I know how to say observation, feeling, need, request. Done, I don't need to do anymore. But that is not really what NVC is. It has within it a willingness to engage with other people and with ourselves in ways that go against the official narrative. It requires trust, it requires vulnerability, it requires tenderness, it requires interdependence. All of these things are not available in the normative culture. Does that ring true for you? That
Yes.
means it requires us to go slightly or a lot against the grain, depending on all kinds of factors. There's only so many people who will do it. It's not like I know exactly what the number is. And, if it's in a place where speaking in public can land you in jail, fewer people will practice NVC than in a place where there is official freedom and the constraints are more subtle. And still, it's only going to be a proportion of the population that will embark on a journey like this. And that proportion, in my mind, is not likely to be enough to create change. So still, I want to take the magic wand and say, okay, poof, we touched the world, created the condition, and now we have billions of people all embedded in a consciousness of nonviolence, practicing. First of all, they all somehow jump-started into being able to engage with it only at the interpersonal level. Let's say they only know how to do it internally and interpersonally. They learned the NVC that is most available, which is at only those two levels. Now, what are they going to do? What are they going to do?
I think make different choices.
As individuals, yes, they're going to make different choices. But then they're going to go to the workplace. And in the workplace, there's going to be a boss. Right? And I come to my workplace and there's a boss. And the boss tells me what to do. And there's something about the boss telling me what to do that is like, wait a minute, why? We're both individual human beings. We both have the same needs. We both care about the same things. We're both here to work for the same purpose. Why are you telling me what to do? Suddenly we become subversive just with that NVC consciousness. So we wouldn't tolerate the existing structures for very long. We would change the social institutions if indeed 7.8 billion people suddenly embraced NVC consciousness. The institutions will come down crumbling and other ones will be established that are based on needs.
Yeah, and I also see that, the basics of NVC vis-a-vis intention to connect and also empathy to self and the other itself is creating ripple effects. As I experience in India, the systems are ridiculous, and we are forming parallel systems through our interdependence and our engaging with the intention to connect. And sometimes when I talk to people in communities which are really struggling right now, the empathy that I receive is so basic and so pure that I believe that when Marshall said that NVC is what we already have. And maybe some of us need to uncondition ourselves. But many people on the ground level already have that naturally.
It's also a different narrative. And this is another place where it comes in friction with the existing society. Because something happens, let's say something happens. For example, in the United States, there is a president that there is a large segment of the population that believes is a danger to the whole world, endangering the continued survival of the human species. People believe that. You can believe that and have tenderness and empathy for the man, or you can believe that and treat the man like an evil thing. If you are deeply embedded in the practice of NVC, you will think about him differently from your, buddies who maybe you are a radical leftist, maybe you are a radical anarchist, maybe you are liberal, maybe whatever you are, your colleagues are more likely than you to diagnose him, to make him other, to treat him like he's not human. So for you to say, wait a minute, let's try to understand where he's coming from, what is going on for him, what happened to him that brought him to this. And people are going to say, oh, come on, what is going on with you? You are softy. So even people who are opposing the existing regime are embedded within the narrative of us and them. The NVC narrative goes in a different direction. It creates friction. Also, if you are really deeply absorbing the NVC framework, you're going to treat your children differently. And when you treat your children differently, it is amazing how much people believe that it is their right to tell other people how to parent their children. So people are going to say, what are you doing? I mean, this is just not imaginary. My sister and her wife got this all the time. What do you mean negotiating with a 3-year-old? You tell a 3-year-old what to do. And they didn't. And people were, that's part of what I mean, that it takes a lot of courage, a lot of tenacity, a lot of strength. Now, when you're surrounded with a bunch of other people who are also doing it, it becomes easier. But that's no longer individual. Then you're in a community setting that gives you more strength. Does that help?
Yeah. Would you call that an alternate system in the making?
It's not on a large enough scale, and it isn't self-aware as an alternate system. This is part of my concern about the way that a lot of people practice NVC, is they keep it at the level of individual skill. And even when they create successfully different agreements and different systems, they're not aware that that's what they did. It's beginning to happen now within certain parts of the NVC community, that people are saying, wait a minute, we're actually creating something different, not just in relationships, but in terms of what kind of institutions we're going to create. Because there isn't such a thing as not having systems, because systems are just sets of agreements. So if you're coming at it from a different narrative, from a needs perspective, from an intention to care for needs, then you will create different systems.
Yeah.
And you're going to have quite a bit of challenge, because the old systems are internalized in each of us, and we don't have very strong habits of what the other one looks like. So as soon as somebody does something that I don't like, the separation reasserts itself. So there's quite a bit of conflict within a lot of these communities, because we haven't built explicit conscious agreement about what to do when this happens and what to do when that happens.
And also, I love that Marshall talks about social change a lot.
Yeah.
So that's my hope. Thank you. Yeah.
Let me ask a question, because I think it relates to something you just said about connection between systems and agreements. And early on, as we were having a walk, you also talked about systems and practices. And so my question, and to be able to see systems and create systems, we need to have an understanding of what they are, almost like a bit of a recipe, and they have certain ingredients to them. So what practices or system could be put in place to help us to change the narrative about human nature? So worldwide, how could we change this narrative through a systemic lens?
From which vantage point? In other words, who am I who's going to be changing it? Am I the president of the world that is suddenly given powers to change it? Or am I a person who writes articles? We're not disembodied. We are located somewhere. So from within which location are you talking about creating this change?
Well, that's an interesting one, because already straight away, one ingredient of creating a system is clarity about our vantage point and our leverage capacity for leverage. So not everybody can create any system. We need to be able to say we are located somewhere, and we have particular resources, and we have a particular purpose in mind. So let's imagine then that for that question, we are an association of teachers in radical school, or association of teachers. I mean, it doesn't have to be radical schools, but like teachers that want to reform the education system in a particular nation, for example, and that's where they want to start.
And are given some kind of mandate, so it's not just writing something on paper. Because I created a system for global governance with a few people. That system doesn't exist except on paper.
Yeah,
it works beautifully on paper, fantastic.
Yes,
but it helps no one. So but let's say if I was part of a group that was thinking about how to change the educational system within a particular country and didn't have power, then I would think, what are our leverage points? So maybe some of us, I'm going to just weave a scenario because it's not something I've thought about. Maybe some of us are professors in a university, so we can work on a research agenda. You know, one of the more positive things that I've seen happen in the last 10, 15 years is that there's more and more research that takes to task the Homo economicus model of narrative that we have. There's a lot of cracks, even from within the scientific paradigm, a lot of cracks within that narrative. That's fantastic, but that's too generic. If I was interested in educational reform, I potentially would do research on schools that have had different outcomes. For example, there's this, I know an example in particular. There was a teacher in Israel many years ago who was teaching in a very remote rural town, which had mostly immigrants from North Africa, very despised within the intra-Jewish ethnic hierarchy. They were low. And most of them barely graduated from high school. And then when they graduated from high school or didn't, they would get menial jobs. That was their life cycle. This particular teacher produced one cohort after another of kids who went to university and got good jobs. Now, this is not my idea of changing society, but this clearly is, it's clear that this woman did something different. So if I was going to think about creating different educational system, one particular research agenda would be to methodically investigate what are the teachers that achieve radically different results, because they always exist, and extract principles from it, and then publicize those principles and the practices that they use and the skills that you can develop, and create a support group for teachers who want to try to practice in those ways. They help them find each other. All this can be done today, even more than 15 or 20 years ago, because of internet and all of that. And then you start creating both a change in the narrative through the research that you publish and support structures for people who are trying to create alternatives. And training for those people, that's one part. Then another part can be, getting funding for alternative schools. There will be somebody who will want to fund it. Another part can be putting proposals to whatever Ministry of Education or whatever the structure is in that country. We're talking about a disembodied country. And that is a way in which you're leveraging your particular point of entry, because you assume that already there's a group of teachers that have decided that this is their project. That's a much easier starting point than, here I am an individual and I want to create change. What do I then do?
Yeah, absolutely. There are a couple of things that I want to say. That I had another related question, which was how do we change that fact that very few people ask questions, and I just remembered as you were speaking of a methodology called the Training for Transformation, which was created based on the work of the Brazilian educator Paulo Freire. And the founders of the Training for Transformation were really keen to work with to enable marginalized communities to be able to start questions about their conditions. and the way they went about that was to train people who were working with people in marginalized communities, primarily in Africa, and then they developed a training program that involved people from the global south generally in teams. And now where the program is going is to support training for transformation programs in the different countries, so the people who were trained originally can then train others and support others to kind of take the methodology, to kind of spread it more and more. And that's a systemic answer to my question as to how we train people to start asking questions. So I quite like kind of starting to see the system that is slowly being put in place around that, particularly that it is marginalized people that need to ask questions to fundamentally question the conditions of their oppression. And I have a following question now, which is, why is it so difficult for us to see systems, to be able to, where is it coming from that we don't have that literacy around systems? Because we don't.
I want to make a comment about what you said before about the training for transformation and then address your question. And the comment is that there's a principle in that. And the principle is that when what you do is training, the more you focus on leadership development, the more ripples you create. So to go back to NVC, for example, I think of NVC as a highly subversive activity when practiced with the consciousness of societal transformation. But most of the people who train other people in NVC don't train them for leadership. They train them to know how to do this in their personal life. And people become very adept at it, but if they don't have the fire to go out apply it beyond their life and pass it on beyond their life, it doesn't become a scaling, self-replicating. It grows linearly. When both the population of the world and our problems are growing exponentially, a linear thing will never catch up with an exponential thing. So that's a key principle of transformation, is that you aim to leverage the change by focusing on individuals or groups that are most likely to replicate it. So it's not just going to turn into consumption, but it's going to turn around and keep going. Like the franchise model, franchise model of social change. Just made it up. Now, in terms of your question, it's very subtle. It's subtle and very deep. And so I want to focus on two people. One is Darwin and one is Freud. Both of these people didn't have any thought that they were going to be part of creating narratives. They lived their life. They did their research. They discovered what they thought they discovered. But if you take a step back and look at them systemically, neither of them would likely have been possible 100 or 200 years before they were. Because the world that was in place 100 or 200 years before them was a world that was based on commons, on intact communities, on collective awareness, not systemic, but collective awareness of some whole larger than self. Both of them emerged. They were possible in a world that has already been severed from community and has become individualized. So the family that Freud investigated was a very particular type of family, which is a kind of like Victorian turn of the century type bourgeois family. But he assumed He treated it like it was a universal family. And so by doing that, he localized whatever problems we have to the relationship between us and our parents in a very particular type of family. It doesn't apply to other types of families in other types of places. But that becomes both possible by the social changes that happen, the material conditions changed, and then suddenly you can look at a family as if it is a unit all to itself. That's already the product of changes that happen in the society. Now it gets theorized because a lot of narratives, the production of narratives is the production of a particular class in society. It's the theoreticians, the investigators, the academics, the priests in previous times. It's the people who hold the power of knowledge. They are the ones who shape the narrative. You know, I learned recently the fact that in the US, you write, for example, color, C-O-L-O-R, and in the UK, C-O-L-O-U-R, that's the doing of one human being. One human being, I don't remember what I read, but one human being created these standards that changed it in the US about, I don't know, maybe 180 years ago. And that's it. And then it was done. And then it affects millions of people. But in order for one individual to be able to do that, they need to be placed in a particular place where they have that kind of influence. I can say from here until the sun turns blue that I want to change it back, but it's not going to happen because I don't carry that kind of influence. So this thing about change in the material conditions of our living makes it possible to see things this way or that way, which before it cannot happen. And then where you're positioned in society makes your thinking more or less powerful. So narratives are not immediately available to anyone to change. One of the things that are interesting about our times is that it's not exactly democratization of knowledge production. I would call it a randomization of knowledge production. Any one of us can try to go viral. That didn't used to happen, but it now is possible. The chances are very small, but it still does happen every once in a while. There was a person, I don't know, about 10 years ago or less, I don't remember. In Israel, he posted a message on Facebook about caring about the people in Iran or in Syria, which is I can't even remember what it was. I think it was Iran, which is supposedly an enemy country with Israel. And he posted some picture that he and his children made that was a peace picture. Pressed whatever you press to publish something on Facebook, went to sleep. Innocent. The next morning, hundreds of responses. Within a few months, this became a mini movement of both Iranians and Israelis, posting all kinds of things. And there was like a little kindling. It didn't catch into creating change, but it did happen. So it makes this really interesting times because there is a high degree of unpredictability when the controls of very, very, very intensively structured institutions are loosened. Suddenly certain things become possible, but we can't control them, we can't predict. So the question, how do you create change? The answer is always, we don't know. So I think that was the answer to your question about why we don't know about narratives, yeah?
Why we have so little systemic awareness? Why is so little capacity to see systems, and therefore so little capacity to invent systems? Because that's one thing I recognize in you is like, you know, they just pop up, you know, like just here's a system we can create about this particular thing. You know, it's really easy for you to imagine creating any system as long as you know a few parameters. I think it's very hard for most of us to do that. We don't have it in us.
Yeah, I think that my guess would be that the individualizing move was semi-intentional. I don't think it's like an evil design, but it clearly served a purpose. What I know was absolutely intentional is diverting people's attention from looking at social problems to looking at personal consumption. That was done absolutely intentionally by no other than Freud's nephew, Edward Bernays. He was hired by the ruling group within the US because they recognized that by allowing, you know, universal vote, they were giving up a lot of power. And they wanted to disempower people's capacity to think about social problems by diverting their attention to see everything as a personal thing that they could work out through consuming the right thing. That was his task. I mean, the man has quite a bit of blood on his hand. He is directly responsible for making it okay for the US to get involved in coups in Latin America. He created the PR campaigns that normalized and justified it. This is not just buy this product rather than that product. He was involved in very carefully crafted PR campaigns. He created the science of PR, of public relations. And you know, I wish I could meet him in the moment when he found out that Goebbels was using his discoveries to create propaganda in Nazi Germany. What that was like for a Jew to recognize that what he created was used to kill millions of his fellow Jews. I don't envy him in that moment. But that was done absolutely intentionally. So there's a difference for me between evil design and just instrumentalizing what is going to work for my needs. It's not evil. It's not against people. It's just without care for people. Here's what will work for me, and you know, whatever the cost. Yeah. And the thing about asking questions, I think that probably would be a core principle in that imaginary association of teachers. A core principle of liberatory education is get students to ask questions. And most especially the why question. And the reality is every child who is not severely abused too early spends a few years asking why questions. Every child. Most of us are trained out of it. So what it was that made it possible for me to never stop asking the why questions, I don't actually know.
So my question is about questioning and imagination and the connection between them. And I'm kind of connecting it to safety and the thinking, especially if one is from a marginalized community or like middle class, or like, I don't want to lose what I already have because it's a question of safety. And especially if my trust has been violated in a relationship, if I've been educated in a way, it's saying that don't trust people. That's kind of like there's violation of relationship, so there's trauma. I don't want to lose the little safety that I have. So it's maybe safer for me not to question and not to imagine. and maybe like the question of why some people can ask those questions and what could actually give enough safety, if there is a such thing, to people for imagining.
Yeah, I'm really liking, the question you're asking, because it points yet again to the fallacy of putting it on the individual. Because if we keep waiting for individuals to bootstrap themselves out of the traumatic conditions of their individual lives, we're going to wait for a very long time. Some few of us will do it, but not otherwise. So when I don't know many details about this program, Training for Transformation, that Viren was talking about, but I would be curious to hear if my guess is accurate. You're creating conditions that allow people to feel a sense of support that comes from something outside their own internal resources. So you create a community of learning, you create a community of support, you create a community of doing projects together, so you're not alone. When you are alone, it's going to be hard. And the more marginalized you are, the harder it will be to stand up as an individual. And if you, and as communities actually have retained more sense of community than people with more privilege who have been separated from each other for longer, and in more intensive ways. So it's not like I can create safety for people, but if people come together and they have each other's back, then that gives them more courage. So that is the answer to this for me, is structures of support. Creating structures of support to kind of like serve as a safety net while we are figuring out how to exit from the fear.
Yeah, I'm thinking so much about that level of symptom, and I can see in my life how I've worked at the level of symptom and have said, yeah, of course, let's all go volunteer for this project to whatever it is, save the drowning babies. It's like I can see people getting really excited to kind of help with that and contribute in that way, and yet there is some sort of resistance to going upstream. And in your article, you say you don't even think people are really capable of doing that. And it's kind of making sense when you talk about, how we've had our attention diverted. So, what does it look like to refocus? And do you have any examples of where that's happened?
Yeah, the most impressive example that comes to mind at this moment, not that it's the most impressive thing that happened, but it's so vivid, is the second wave feminism in the US in the 70s brought women together into consciousness raising groups. In consciousness raising groups, what women were doing, they were telling each other their stories. And in telling each other their stories, the commonality of the stories emerged. And suddenly it shifted from being my problem, my deficiency, my inability to cope with the life that I'm supposed to be able to live, to wait a minute, something is being done to us. That takes it upstream. Why are we in this situation rather than why am I in this situation already takes it upstream. So that's one key way that you can do it, is by expanding the vision. Another one is the why, and it's not in this article. There is one of the most potent 7-minute videos that I have seen is Kimberly Jones. How Can We Win? Where the whole video is about going upstream. about a phenomenon that gets put on individuals and made as a character deficiency, which is so-called looting. And what she says is, instead of looking at what people are doing, ask yourself why they're doing it. What are the conditions that create their lives to be so optionless that the only thing they can think of to do is to walk through broken glass and take something in a store that otherwise they have no hope of ever having in their life. So through telling the metaphor of a rigged Monopoly game, she is immediately shifting the narrative about something that is very charged. It's very hard, I think, to watch this video and continue to think about what is happening in those protests and acts of taking things from stores. I think it's very hard to watch this video and think the same thoughts as you did before you watched it.
Yeah.
So this is something we can all do with the people we know. If we are already thinking at least somewhat systemically, and someone we are with doesn't, instead of instructing them, oh no, you should think systemically, let's just ask them, why do you think that is happening? And really keep thinking, what is the question that will lead them to have unrehearsed answers? If I ask questions that the person knows the answer to, or for which there is a right answer, I'm not being generative. If I ask questions that require the person to think freshly about something for which they don't know the answer yet it is within their reach to find it, and there is no right answer that we give them, that's a generative field. And my belief is, and I think it's the belief that any of us that have been engaging in transformational practices, is that when you create those conditions, people start thinking outside of what was given to them. Yeah.
Love it. Thank you so much.
I'm resonating a lot with those criteria for how to ask questions. I'm wishing I could do that. So in your article, you mentioned that.
Let's do it for a second. What prevents you from being able to come up with those questions? Do you know?
I guess probably I have a habit where I want to establish perhaps commonality with somebody. And so I'm asking a question that's leading in some way, that I'm trying to figure out where they stand on something. Is it close to my position or not?
Okay, so then you want to ask yourself, what questions can I ask that maintain a sense of commonality and also at the same time open up new thinking?
Yeah.
So it's not either or. All right, and now you're
yeah,
going to ask me a question.
I have a pre-written question here. What's been on my mind has been the recent wave of protests, and thinking about lots of people being on the street and kind of returning to the new normal or the pandemic habitual scenario in the home. And I'm thinking what would be needed to maintain the momentum still while we're having prolonged physical distancing. and having to overcome some of these barriers of gathering?
First of all, the usual caveat, I don't actually know, right? I don't know. I'm just thinking. I'm thinking what got people to the streets was a no. It was a big no to police brutality. What is missing in the picture is what are they saying yes to? There's only so much energy that you can have from just saying no. There will be some diehards that will maintain that energy of the no and the protest indefinitely. Some people just do. But to maintain the interest of large numbers of people, you need vision. And when you have vision, it gives you a different kind of energy. And this movement hasn't yet created a vision. You know, when I can't in the moment remember if it's in this article or the next article, but when I was looking at the police, defund the police, and I'm talking about how do you create change? You need to have a vision. And I started looking, what are the alternatives to policing that people are putting out? There's hardly anything that is really fully thought out. So it's a no. We don't want police. Okay, I'm not going to argue with you that I do want police. But you're not going to create an alternative by saying no to what exists. You're going to create an alternative by imagining it. If you're not going to be able to imagine it, your energy will not sustain. That's my thought about why it stops, is because you worked out the wave of protest, and now what? I'm curious if that makes sense to you.
Yeah, it does. It makes sense about the big no and a need for perhaps an inspiring vision to keep going. Thank you.
Just as you guys were talking and saying about a vision, I was imagining like at these protests sort of doing, Paulo Freire style theater of the oppressed, and just like doing theater of what the vision would be like. Mm-hmm. That would be, I think, pretty inspiring. And I'm guessing that, when you used some high school students from countries outside the US to talk about the transition, like Ozioma, and the 2 13-year-old girls from Jalila from Palestine and Anat from Israel, to sort of show the world how to do things differently, and to also jumpstart the transition. I was like, wow, there's young women. And then you said also students started creating the eco-regions, working together. And Ozioma reached out to people and started like creating these systems of support that you talk about. So I'm just curious, what led you to put your faith in young people, especially young women from outside the US, to start finding solutions to the challenges we face?
Before fully answering your question, I want to just take apart for a moment the notion of from outside the US, which makes the US the central place in some ways, just framing it like this. The US is just one country among about 200 countries that exist. Its biggest claim to fame is the amount of destruction that it brings to the world.
Thank you for that reminder. I'm noticing I have USA at my little name thing, and that's sort of where the center of my world is right now. So yes, yeah, I appreciate that.
I feel extremely fortunate that I didn't grow up in one country. I twice while growing up lived with my family for 2 years in Latin America. And I think it made a difference to not have just one view. And then as an adult, I've been all over it, have taught in various places on all continents. And the kind of teaching that I do engages me quite intimately with people. So it's kind of like getting peeks at different cultures, not at the level of tourists, but at the level of where people show me the soft belly of their struggles. It is an exquisite honor to know people in that way. So the reason first of all, why youth? I don't know. But I was about halfway through writing the stories, I became conscious that I was doing that. And then from then on, I kept doing it with pleasure. It happened. There is logic to fiction that I think all fiction writers will tell you that it's more following than deciding. You know, the characters become an entity that basically tells you what to do. You can't decide for them. You know, I wrote a novel, and the character in the novel, I was part of a writing group, and every time we got together, we had a prompt. And before choosing the prompt, I checked with my character whether he would have something to give me relative to that prompt, and I would change the prompt if it didn't work. So it's an odd relationship with the characters. I think there's something about not having been yet forced to live and pass on the narratives that makes them a little bit looser than they become later. I remember also hearing from Marshall more than once that when he was training in a school, the higher the grade, the more difficult the training. That the younger kids got it right away and the older kids needed more time, and the teachers were harder than everyone. So I think it is that. Also, I have more faith that solutions are going to come from the global south than from the global north. And the reason is actually something that Paulo Freire has articulated, which is that the training to become an oppressor removes capacity from you. A certain capacity for imagination, especially moral imagination, because being trained to get your needs met at the expense of others is a big reduction of our humanity. So I have a sense that Latin America and Africa are much more generative places in terms of creating alternative ways of being, both because they're closer to what happened before the onslaught of colonization, and because they are continually being oppressed. I'm not romanticizing being oppressed. The majority of people who are oppressed are basically in survival mode and don't manage to do anything more than that. But there is some wiggle room somewhere. I remember this when I had a conversation, my first conversation, intimate conversation with a German person who was crying about his mother having been part of the Hitlerjugend and his father being in the Wehrmacht and being a prisoner of war, and how much violence there was at home. And he was crying while being drunk about how that violence has stuck to him. And he doesn't think he will ever be free of it. And here I am, a Jew from Israel, having been raised on the Holocaust. And suddenly I'm having this thought, wow, it's easier to be on the side of the victim. Morality is on my side. It's harder for him than it is for me in some very, very deep way. So I think it's not an accident that that I picked someone from the global south to do the jumpstart. And in terms of the Palestinian and the Israeli girl, specifically, it's one of the places where oppressed and oppressor are intertwined in complex, multi-layered places. If anyone is going to figure out how to create liberation without passing trauma to the next group, they're going to figure it out. If they figure it out, they will figure it out for the whole world. And so there was some poetic justice to it, because there's so much concentrated pain. And, you know, essentially the Jews came to what is now Israel for their own liberation, ended up doing it at the expense of creating trauma for the Palestinians. And now there are many Palestinians who are wanting to create liberation for themselves by passing the trauma back to the Israeli Jews. This ping pong game is not going to go anywhere. And so that's why I think there is some, what's the word, kind of like collective unconscious type way in which assigning that task to people in Israel and Palestine makes sense to me, to figure out how to work out liberation without passing trauma to the next group. I don't see any better place to do that than a place that has been in conflict for the whole of human history, I think.
And as you say that, I'm feeling like a deep yearning for that to really happen. So yeah, putting a vision of how it might be able to happen out there, you know, is empowering and powerful.
Yes. Absent vision, we will just recreate what we have.
Yeah.
This is why this speech, the Martin Luther King speech, is so powerful. It's like the repeat. I have a dream. I have a dream. I often tell people, he didn't say I have a nightmare or I have a complaint. No one would remember a speech for very long if it was, I have a complaint. Nah. It's, I have a dream, painting this possible reality that you immediately want to go do something about. That's what I'm doing in this synopsis to this movie and in the stories in the book, is painting a picture, detailed picture, practical picture with the systems semi-spelled out so that you can see that it's not a utopia. The stories are not stories of utopia. They're stories of real people with real challenges that are not too different from the ones that we have, but they work it out very differently because they have a systemic support to do things differently where needs are placed in the center and willingness is placed in the center.
And I really appreciate that, because it shows that when systems are in place, individuals can work together to address everyday problems and hard problems in the world. And it's not up to just the saviors that we create under this individualized system.
Yep, exactly. Thank you.